afternoon. Welcome to Sociology 1. So we're picking up where we left off last week, and we're still trying to understand if Karl Marx and conflict theory are correct, and not everyone thinks they are, but if they're correct that capitalism leads to massive inequality and ultimately to a situation that's intolerable for most people, and then those people want to overthrow capitalism, why didn't that happen? And so we've been asking, at least here in America, America is very much a capitalist society still, a long time after Marx, so what saved it? And we were talking about the fact that the Great Depression that happened in the 1930s almost killed capitalism, and a lot of the things that looked like Marx predicted were happening. Massive inequality, people starting to want leaders that weren't capitalists. And so we started to talk about, well, how did capitalism respond to that major crisis where the whole system almost came down? And the first thing we mentioned was Fordism, getting people, or trying to make workers be well paid enough and products be cheap enough that workers would want to buy them and be able to buy them. And related to that, I didn't write it up here, it was consumerism, teaching people to want to buy the things that capitalism has to offer and creating a kind of system where people might not love their jobs, but they like the pleasure that capitalism can provide in terms of products and entertainment and all of that. We also mentioned consumerism kind of keeps people having fun rather than being political and questioning the system and trying to change anything. But then we also talked about the New Deal, which was President Roosevelt's plan for fixing the Great Depression. And we talked about a few things under there. One was the government being the referee between capital and labor, keeping people from killing each other. Mainly the thing was letting unions happen. Letting workers have unions was one way to make the conflict more a negotiation between people rather than a fight, a violent fight. And then we also talked about the social safety. Well, we talked about public employment, putting people to work for the government, doing things that business wouldn't do, and that included war. So WPA and World War II were two things that helped put people back to work, but also helped build the country. Not so much the war, but it did help us in certain ways. But then the social safety net was something else that we talked about. So things like unemployment and Social Security and welfare were put in place because capitalism is a competitive system and people are often thrown out of work for no reason that they can predict or affect. And so a smart capitalist society is one that has a safety net in place so that when that happens, people don't just end up completely pouring on the street like they did during the Great Depression. What we haven't talked to you about yet might be the most important, and that is the idea of growing the middle class. A capitalist society, it was seen, could be a lot more stable if you had people in the middle rather than just haves and have-nots. When Marx looked at capitalism, it looked like this, a small group at the top and a big group at the bottom, and that's easy to see maybe how this group will want to get rid of that little parasite at the top and just be one people. But if you have some at the top, a big middle, and some at the bottom, then maybe that's a little bit more of a stable kind of society. And so how can you grow that middle class? How can you have people that are have-somes? Maybe that's a good way to think about them. These are kind of like the haves, the wealthy, and have-nots, but a stable society would be one where most people could feel like, well, I'm not a have-not, and might not be the richest, but I've got enough to be happy. And so people who ran our society and government and business began to think about, and government and business were working together more closely now, and government and business were trying to figure out how can we build a middle class that's going to be what's needed to prevent our society from becoming, like it was during the Great Depression or like Marx predicted that it could become. And so how do you grow the middle class? Well, the two big things are home ownership and a college education. These are two things that if people have their own home, they can feel like they're a have-some. They own property. They own a piece of the capitalist system if they own a home. If the capitalist system is doing well, their home price will probably go up. So they probably want to see stocks go up and property values go up. If you don't own your home, then you don't really think like a capitalist. Capitalists are looking every day to see if property values go up, if stocks are going up. And if you don't own any stock or property, then you're not even worried about that. You're just like, can I pay my bills? But if you own a house, you begin to think a little bit more like capitalists do, and you want to protect the capitalist system the way capitalists do. So you can see how the people who ran the society wanted more and more people to be homeowners. And then also, if you can get into be a professional or a manager, it's one thing to be a worker at a factory, but to be the manager of the factory is a little bit better than being a worker. But to be the manager, you need a college education, and to be a professional, to be something like a doctor or a lawyer or a psychologist or something like that. That's another level of our society that people can get to. But they need higher education. And at this time, back in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, higher education here in California, for example, was really only the UC system. Basically, if you wanted to go to college, you pretty much had to be wealthy already, and you pretty much had to be white, and you pretty much had to be a male. That's pretty much who went to university in the 1930s. But after the 1930s, after the Great Depression, and after the war ended especially, World War II went from 1940 to 1945 for us here in America. And when it ended in 1945, the country began to say, well, how can we expand college? How can we make it more possible for more people to go to college? And so California, for example, and was typical of a lot of states in the United States, built the whole Cal State system, a whole new university system that wasn't just for the wealthy and the elite, but was affordable and was for regular people to go train to be things like nurses and cops and teachers, other kinds of more professional level middle class jobs. And the community college system was also expanded greatly during this time of the 1940s and 50s, again, to create the opportunity for a middle class to grow. And if you don't have universities and colleges for people to go to, they can't learn the things they need to be part of this class. And so a good example of a government effort to grow the middle class was the GI Bill. Millions of guys came back from World War II. 2 million men came back from the war. And these are men that were fighting war for a few years. And if you've been fighting war for a few years and you're a young man, that's not necessarily the kind of guy you want coming back into your society, because the society is trying to remain stable and healthy. And why do you think we might be worried about 2 million men coming back from war? What kinds of instability might that create for a society? If you were the president and they said, well, we have 2 million young men who've just been killing people and being shot at for 5 years, and now they're coming back around regular people, what might you be worried about? They might be violent. They might be, still in their war mentality. We might also be worried about the young women around because, guys that have been in war haven't really been around young women for a long time. And, one of the famous pictures from guys coming home from World War II is a guy bending over a woman and kissing her. It became a famous picture of kissing that girl, but we now know that it might have been more like sexual assault. I mean, she was just on the street and the soldier came up and grabbed her and started kissing her. Anyway, the point being is, the country had to figure out, how are we going to get 2 million men back into our society without causing disruption? And we also need to grow our middle class. And we also need to stimulate consumerism. We need people to buy stuff. So what the GI Bill did was basically give every guy that came back from the war $10,000. They were called GIs, these soldiers. And the $10,000 they were given, they were told, well, you served your country really well, and we want to reward you. That's why we're giving you $10,000. But here's what we want you to do with it. And by the way, we're talking about 1945 dollars, so I haven't done the math, but in today's dollars, I think you could imagine something like 100,000. Imagine you're 21 years old and you come back from the war and the government says, here's 100,000 bucks. And you can't just use it any old way, but I don't think, but the policy specifically pointed them to say you can spend it on a house. You can put a down payment on a house. Or you can go to college, or you can do both. And the idea of that was, we want you to form families. We want you to get married. We want you to start having babies. And we want you to settle down and buy a house and become part of the middle class. And the idea of giving them houses had a number of benefits. For one thing, it makes you more marriageable. Back in those days, women didn't have a lot of options. What they had an option was find a nice guy to marry. And if a guy has a house and he's ready to start having a family, then he's a very eligible young man. And so a lot of people started moving into what are called the suburbs, this new area of American life where you're not in the city and you're not in the country. You're like in a place like, Edgewater or Plumas Lake with your own house. And you begin buying stuff, all kinds of things for your house, TVs, refrigerators, beds, drapes, all kinds of things. And so this was a very smart public policy is what I'm saying, is it helped create the post-World War II economy where we stopped fighting the war, so businesses couldn't make money building bombs and missiles anymore. Now they had to find a new way to make money, and they did it through consumerism, through getting people to buy all the stuff that capitalism makes. Not war. War is another kind of consumerism, but this is domestic consumerism, where it's regular people buying the things that keep business going, keep people hiring, keep money flowing into the country. And not only that, it helped create a whole class of people that were middle-class people that owned their own homes, that started to become educated in college, and a lot of these people were people that came from families that never went to college, farming families, working families whose parents never went to college. So it was a whole new class of people in America starting to form the basis of a middle class. And so from the next 40 years, I'm going to tell you, America did really, really well. People call this the Great Prosperity, or I like to call it the Golden Age of American capitalism. And our current presidential candidate keeps talking about when America was great. I don't know exactly when he means. When Donald Trump says, "Make America great again," when was it great before, according to him? I don't know which period he means. Maybe he means back during the slavery times. That's when it was great. I don't know what he means. But I think what a lot of his followers might mean is it was great back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s when America was the #1 economy in the world. And so what we need to describe is economic restructuring. We saved capitalism, but then we start to undo some of those changes. And so we can have a timeline in mind here. 1945 was when the war ended and all those GIs came back from Europe and Japan. And now we are in 2016, as I'm sure you're aware. 1985 is when I like to put a turning point, because that's when things started to really change in America, was the mid-1980s. And we can say that this period, I like to call it the golden age of American capitalism. Why? It was an age of prosperity, meaning we were doing well economically. And the well, when we say it was doing well, people's incomes were going up every year. If you looked at people's incomes, they were getting better and better. And people's children were doing better than they were. So that World War II generation came home and they had a bunch of kids. Those kids are called the baby boom now, and the reason they're called the baby boom is because so many of them were born in these new families that were being started. So a huge number of babies were born in America after 1945, from about 1945 till about 1965. Lots of babies were getting born, and lots of new houses being bought and started. And America was doing really well economically, and that was baby boomers grew up and they did better than even the World War II parents. So we can say America was rising economically, and our economy was growing. If you look at how much we were producing every year, we were producing more and more. And around the world, people around the world began to say, looks like America's got things figured out. Your people are happy, you're having fun, you're not just working all the time, you're also like making rock music and movies and TV shows, and around the world people are looking at America like, wow, you've figured out how to have a society where most people are pretty happy, instead of a society where people are constantly at each other's throats. And it's true that we were at that time what's called a manufacturing-based society. What does manufacturing mean?
Make things.
Making things. Factories. Factories are where things get manufactured. And what was America famous for manufacturing? Well, cars. Cars is our most famous product. The Chevys, the Fords, all those cars. But, refrigerators, TVs, all kinds of things America manufactured. And what we had during this time was what's called a blue-collar middle class. You not only had those professional middle-class people, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and managers, but workers themselves began to be middle-class people. When we say blue-collar, we mean manual labor, hard work. So if you were working, say, for General Motors, if you were working in a factory in Detroit, Michigan, making cars, you were a blue-collar worker, meaning you sweated all day. You probably came to work in a blue work suit or work shirt or work, jumpsuit. And yeah, you worked all day hard and you sweated all day, but if you were a blue-collar middle-class person, it's manual labor, but good pay. You were probably making, in 1975, you were probably making about $50,000 a year, maybe more, $50,000 to $75,000 a year in today's dollars. You had full benefits, medical, dental, all that. You had probably a month or two, at least 2 weeks, but probably a month vacation. So you're working in a factory like a working class guy, but you have a middle class life. And these were the kinds of jobs that people could get right out of high school. They didn't need to go to college or anything like that, so you could get out of high school, marry your sweetheart, go work in the factory, buy your house, maybe even buy a country house. And you could be a happy American. After 1985, we begin to see a whole different America. And we're seeing it right now. People call this period the new economy. What's new about it? Well, we are now no longer a manufacturing-based society. We now have a service-based economy. What's the difference between service and manufacturing? What jobs are you applying for? Are you training to be? I would guess that most people in this room, you're not planning to go into a career where you're making stuff. You're probably not planning to go into a career where you're going to be in a factory or working for a company even that owns factories. You're probably, a lot of you, going into medical, nursing, maybe. Maybe you're going into law enforcement. Maybe you're going into teaching. Maybe you're going into retail. Anyway, all of those are services, not manufacturing. And that's what most people do in America today. We don't have a lot of factories in America anymore, and that's something to think about. Where did all this manufacturing go? But the thing about service-based economy is it's not really very middle class. There isn't much of a middle class when it comes to a service-based economy. There's high-end service jobs, and there's low-end service jobs. High-end service jobs have high pay and benefits, and they tend to require a lot of skill and education. Whereas low-end service are kind of the opposite of that. They tend to have low pay and maybe no benefits, or very low ones. And they tend to be low skill and education, low education requirements. So many Americans today find themselves in this kind of, most jobs today in America are this. And probably the reason a lot of you are in here in this classroom right now is you're hoping to get into one of these. You're hoping to move into high-end service. So things like medical and nursing and even law enforcement and prison guards and stuff, some of that is more high-end service. You can get a middle-class life from that. But a lot of these jobs are the ones that are getting created today. But also what's missing is that middle class, and especially what's missing are blue-collar middle-class jobs. So that means today, if you want to get into the middle class, you're really looking at higher education as your main route to do that. Meanwhile, higher education is getting much more expensive than it used to be, and the spots are getting fewer, and so there's a lot of competition there. But we've also, what I'm trying to show here is we've kind of undone. We just talked about all the things that saved capitalism, the things that were done in the 30s and 40s, and those things helped produce this great era of prosperity. now we're kind of undoing those things. Our middle class is going away. So we grew the middle class, now we're shrinking it. Another thing we did was basically we've ended welfare as we know it. Bill Clinton did that. So in 1995, welfare ended as we know it. So you can still get some kind of benefits, but they're temporary aid to needy families. So our social safety net is another thing that's smaller than it used to be. And our middle class is smaller than it used to be. And unions are much smaller than they used to be. Workers had a lot more power back in the 50s and 60s when in the height of things in 1975, when this worker here was making $50,000 working in a factory, that's when you had 40% of Americans in unions in 1975. In 2016, I think I just read it's 7% of people are in a union. And as you may know, the Yuba City teachers are on strike right now. If you have a union, you can do things like go on strike and try to get better wages, but most Americans are not part of unions nowadays, and so if they're told, well, you are working for $10 an hour, they take it, and they try to live on that. But keep in mind, if you're working at minimum wage in America today, you fall below the poverty line. You can work full-time in America real hard at a minimum wage job, and you will be considered in the poverty group in America. So we're talking about a time back here where the lowest paid jobs almost put you in the middle class. Nowadays, they put you in poverty. And so, yeah, I agree with Donald Trump that we used to do things better in America in terms of making sure a greater number of people had more chance to be in the middle class. And I certainly think that lots of other things are better in a country when more and more people are able to have the security and stability of being in a middle class life. So I agree with him there, but I don't think Donald Trump has done much sociology or read much sociology, and his analysis of why we've ended up this way isn't always totally accurate, although I'm going to end up saying some of the same things he does. So what I'm trying to show you is that we undid a lot of what saved capitalism, and now we're looking at a society that's very unequal. Our society looks much more like Marx talked about. A lot of people are talking about the 1% nowadays controls much more of the wealth than it ever did. They're huge, and the 99% of people has much less of the wealth than they ever did. And so we look a lot like the society that Marx was talking about. Not only that, who was running for president this year? Well, aside from Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders ran, and he's a socialist. He says, I'm not a capitalist, I'm a socialist, and lots of people said that's what we need, a non-capitalist running things. So there again, that's what Marx predicted, that large numbers of people would begin to be turned off by a capitalist system that makes them feel like my whole life is just to make these people happy. I work real hard every day and be in poverty so they can be rich. A lot of people don't like the sound of that, and they begin to rebel against it. But just to give you some figures that aren't just off the top of my head, but are actually on a chart, and people always want to see a chart. So I'll give you a chart here. How do I turn this on? No. Let's see. Oh, I got to turn this on too. That would be a good idea. I'm showing you the inequality here in America. So this is 1963. It doesn't go all the way back to the post-World War II period, but you see that this yellow line are the top group. They're in the top 10% of wealthy people. And this is the 50th, people in the middle, and these are the bottom 10%. And what you see here is, for most people, their income, their family income, has basically stayed flat since 1963. Not making any more. In fact, for a lot of people, it's a little bit less than used to be the case. What you see here, though, is the top group is doing much, much, much better than they ever did. And so that's a question we have to ask ourselves as a society. Are these rich people working much harder than they used to? Are they so much better than people used to be? I mean, were the rich people over here just not as much better than these people, and so they didn't earn as much, and now they're much better, so they earn a lot more? Or what explains the higher income? And what this shows too, I could show more charts for you, but I don't want to bore you with charts. But you're basically seeing that the middle class and poor people, their fortunes have been going down over the last several decades, and the rich people have done much better. And you really see that the inequality starts to take off right around here. Right around the late 80s, early 90s, they start to go live in a different place than the rest of us. And it gets, the inequality is even more pronounced the higher up you go. If you go to the top 10th of 1% of all people, they are much, much, much richer than they used to be. And so that raises a question. Marx said that wealth comes from work. And we know that these top wealthiest people, they don't do much work. So who's doing all the work that's making people wealthy? And why are they getting so wealthy but the workers aren't? Back in this period when Roosevelt created the New Deal, he said, what's good for General Motors is good for America, meaning if we help General Motors prosper, we're all going to prosper. And that's what happened. But then we see after 1985, most of us aren't really prospering. The top group really is. And so what accounts for that? So what we've done is restructured our economy from a manufacturing to a service-based, and we've restructured our class structure from one that was a more balanced middle-class structure to a much more polarized, unequal structure. And the question is why, and you probably have some idea why. What does Donald Trump say caused this?
Sending jobs overseas.
Sending jobs overseas is the main answer that a lot of people are talking about, and it has to do with globalization. And that's not the whole story, because automation is another thing. More machines, more computers doing more of the work that humans used to do. And that, again, also tracks with what Marx says, that polarization is caused by relative surplus value. When companies start putting in machines, they start laying off workers. And you end up with a situation where lots of people don't have a role in the economy. They're just unemployed people. And that's not healthy for a society. So we have to ask, well, why have we done this? And we have to ask, well, what is globalization? Because globalization is the short answer to what changed at around 1985. And thinking about that timeline, 1985 is the turning point. So what do we mean by globalization? Well, the sociological explanation, and we're going to talk about globalization a couple times in this course. Later on in the final chapter, we'll ask, how is the world changing because of globalization? So we're looking more at the world itself. But right now we're asking, how is America changing because of globalization? And I'm going to be presenting to you what's called the critique of globalization. There are many people who think globalization is great, and they would be saying things I'm not going to say yet here. I'm talking about, the effect on America, and from an American worker's perspective, it hasn't been all that great. And from a conflict theory perspective, globalization hasn't been all that great yet. We'll also hear the case for globalization. That's the side that says this is a good thing that's going on, and we'll talk about that later on in the final chapter of the class. But for now, we're just asking, how has America changed? And from an American standpoint, what is globalization? Well, for us, it just means mobility of capital. Capital is investment money. If you may have money in your pocket, but that's money you need for lunch, or money you need for your rent, or money you need for groceries. That's cash. Capital is money that you have after you've met all your needs. You have this extra money left over that you can use to invest in things. And so when we talk about capital, we're really talking about banks and large investment firms. We're talking about large amounts of, billions of dollars out there that are held by investment entities like banks. And they are much freer nowadays, these banks and hedge funds and other investment entities, to invest their capital wherever they want. When we say mobility, We mean it's mobile. It can go where it wants to go. And the main thing that makes capital mobile is free trade agreements. Let's go back to 1985, because that was one of the first times we begin to see this change in America. Like I said, General Motors was one of the big manufacturing companies in Detroit in this period of America, 45 to 1985. General Motors was making good profits in 1985. They were making enough money to satisfy their investors, so it wasn't like they were losing money. But the people who ran General Motors began to say, well, what if we could have cheaper workers? Because our workers right now, like we said, make $75,000 a year. They have benefits. They had all this nice stuff. So right around 1985 and 1986, the first free trade zone opened up in Mexico. And it's called the Maquiladora region. It's a little strip of land right on the border of Mexico. And that strip of land right on the border of Mexico and the United States, it was just called a free trade zone, meaning there's no, it's not America, it's not Mexico, it's not any country, it's just a free trade zone. And that free trade zone meant if you were a company like General Motors, well, you could go build a factory in the free trade zone. And who would work in the free trade zone? Well, people who want to work for $1 an hour. And who would do that? Well, people in Mexico. And so General Motors began setting up these factories on the border where they could hire non-American people to work in their factories right there on the border. And it worked out really nicely for General Motors. You could make a lot more profit making cars with people working for $1 an hour than people working for $75,000 a year. Like I said, it wasn't that General Motors was losing money. They were profitable. But this was more profitable. So they moved down there. And a lot of other companies began to do that too. And they were closing factories up in Michigan and other places. Eventually they said, well, why should it just be one strip along the border of Mexico? Why not make all of Mexico a place where we can invest money? And so one of the first big free trade agreements that Americans know about is NAFTA, which stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. What did you have before free trade, this term free trade? Well, as we've said all along, capitalists have always wanted free trade. That's how the capitalist system started, with them wanting freer trade than the kings and queens of Europe were allowing them to have. But for a long time, countries protected their own products. For example, America, we didn't want Japanese cars being sold here. We make our own cars. So we wouldn't want Americans buying Japanese cars, because if they bought Japanese cars, then that money goes to Japan and the Japanese get rich. So we would say, okay, Japan, you can sell your cars here and we'll sell our cars there, but we have to put a special tax on your car. If you're going to sell Japanese car here, there's going to be an import tax on those. And the American cars won't have that import tax. So the American consumer can decide, do they want the little Japanese car that's extra expensive, or do they want the American car that's not as expensive? And the idea was, we're going to protect our own products by putting a tax on them, and Japan does the same thing. Well, free trade was this new idea. Let's not put taxes on each other's products. If Japan, you want to sell stuff here, you can sell it here. If we want to sell stuff there, we'll sell it there. Hey, if we want to build a factory in Mexico, we'll just call it an American factory. Even though it's in Mexico, it's still an American company, it's American. And anyway, so it was like lowering these trade barriers, lowering the walls between our countries when it comes to money. So money can freely flow across, that's what mobility means. And NAFTA is the US, Mexico, and Canada. So those three countries basically say there's no barriers between our countries, or very few. If you want to build a factory in Mexico, it's easier to do than it used to be. If Mexicans want to sell their fruit, Mexican companies want to sell their fruit in this country, it's much easier than it used to be for them to do that. And people are starting to look at NAFTA, and we were told when NAFTA passed, by the way, in 1995. So 10 years of free trade zones made President Clinton, who was a Democrat at the time, and many other leaders at the time say, this is great. Let's make it even bigger. And so they passed the free trade. And nowadays people are saying, well, did this really make things better in America? Did we get much richer as a result of this? And many people, including Donald Trump and many sociologists, and Bernie Sanders, by the way, we're saying, no, it didn't make us better. Might not have even made Mexico better. And so who benefited from it? Well, this top global elite that makes their money by investing around the world, they make a lot of money, but workers in Mexico and the United States aren't really benefiting from all this. There's a new free trade agreement that's being discussed, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It hasn't passed yet. Interestingly enough, President Obama, being the president, has said, well, I favor it. I want us to pass this. But Hillary Clinton is running to replace him as a Democrat, and she says she doesn't support it. And it's odd because her husband was the one who signed NAFTA. So she's in a tough position. The Democratic Party used to support free trade agreements. They were in favor of them. They currently still are because Obama wants to sign it. But the American people are like, we don't know if we like these things. The NAFTA has hurt us. We've lost a lot of jobs. We're not doing so well. And a lot of people were agreeing with Trump and Sanders that this free trade isn't working out so well for America. And so interestingly enough, she has to campaign saying, I don't know if I support this, even though her boss, her former boss, Obama, does support it. So Americans are questioning free trade agreements. But what sociologists have been saying for a long time is, if you allow capital to be mobile, but you don't allow workers to be mobile, because in this new free trade era, workers are not more free to go across the border. Are Mexicans more free to come up to the United States now and work if they want to? No, they do it illegally, and he wants to put a wall up. Are we freer as American citizens to go to whatever country we think we can make the most money in as a worker? No, they'll say, do you have a passport? Are you a citizen? So in terms of labor, you can say what's the simplistic answer to what's happened here is that capital's become much more free to go where it wants to go and become more profitable. Workers are not any freer than they used to be, labor. So this conflict between capital and labor is now evident again. It used to be, in the period I'm talking about, 45 to 85, capital and labor were supposed to be working together to improve things for everybody. Now capital has basically said, bye-bye labor, American labor. We don't like you anymore. You make too much money, you have too much power. We're going to go to other places. And so sociologists have said for a long time that if you allow capital to be mobile, but you don't allow workers to be mobile, then you're going to create a race to the bottom. In a race to the bottom, countries compete for capital. So capital has become mobile. It floats around the planet. And you can think of capital, I think of it as like little spaceships. Like Nike, the company Nike is like a little spaceship. The company Apple is like a spaceship. The company Walmart is like a little spaceship. And what they do is they float around the planet, orbiting the planet, looking for a good place to land for a while. And when they land, they can make money in that country for a while. But they're always looking for a different country to go to pick up and go look for a different country. So that means countries have to try to compete. We want that spaceship to land here. If that spaceship lands here, we're all going to get jobs and we're all going to be doing well. So how do we try to get the spaceship to land? If you were, say, Ecuador, and the spaceships are landing in Mexico, building factories there, and you're Ecuador and you say, well, come on, Nike, build a factory down here. Come on, General Motors, build a factory down here. How do you get those UFOs or those spaceships to land in your country? When we say countries compete for capital, what kinds of things do they say to these global corporations? In other words, we now have global corporations like Nike or Apple or all these big names you've heard of that aren't really, they might have started in America at one time. They were called American companies. Now they're not called American companies. For a while they were called multinational companies because they had many countries they lived in, they worked in. Now we just call them global. They're just on planet Earth and they go where they want to go. And workers have to, in their countries, have to try to get them to come to them. But what can you offer to a global corporation to get it to settle down in your country?
Less rules, less taxes.
Well, what is the number one thing when we thought about profit? How do you get surplus value? How do you get more money? If these companies exist to make profit, what is the primary thing they're looking for?
Lowering the cost of labor.
Cheap labor. So one of the first things you would try to offer to the global corporation, if you were trying to get it to come to you, is our labor is really cheap. Oh, in Mexico, they work for $1 an hour. We'll come down here. We'll work for 50 cents an hour. So cheap labor is one thing. What else could you offer that a company would be looking for? And when we say race to the bottom, it's like each country is trying to go lower than the other. Oh, you only work for $1, we'll work for 50 cents. What else could you go lower than the other country on that would be attractive to a global company? Maybe you don't know. If you've never run a global corporation, maybe you don't know what they're looking for.
Local resource values?
So cheap materials, cheap water, cheap stuff, but what that usually means, what I'm trying to get at here too, is somebody mentioned regulations. So no or few regulations. What kind of regulations? When businesses say they want free trade, that's what they're kind of talking about. We don't want government telling us what to do. And when we say regulation, we're talking about government regulation of companies. So what kinds of things would a company want in terms of what regulations are we talking about that they don't like? That they like, if you think of American companies here in America, what they have to do in terms of the government, what don't they want to deal with?
Labor time.
Well, so one thing are like safety regulations. Workers are supposed to not get injured and killed on the job. And we have in America something called OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, an arm of the government that tries to make sure that companies aren't killing people with their factories and their ways of doing things. But a lot of other poorer countries like Ecuador or something may not have any OSHA or any labor movement. I mean, workers in this country are pretty powerful. They were able to get things like holidays and Labor Day and 8-hour days and Occupational Safety Administration. But in those countries where workers are very powerless, they haven't been able to get those things put in place. So that's one thing companies are looking for, is I don't have to worry about my workers getting hurt because the government doesn't require it. So people might get hurt, that'll be their problem, not mine. Sounds nice if you're trying to make a profit. You don't have to worry about people getting killed or hurt. Bangladesh is one place where a bunch of workers got killed recently, and I don't know if the company was in violation of any rules or not, but safety regulations, Environmental is a huge one. That's one that Americans, we've come to like things like clean air and clean water. And we don't want our companies dumping a bunch of stuff and chemicals into our rivers and burying it in our ground and pumping it in our air. And so we have Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act and lots of regulations on what companies can do or not. And those companies complain all the time, but as we're going to learn later in this class, our air has gotten a lot cleaner, and there's a lot less cancer and other problems in America from air pollution than there used to be. We have other environmental problems, but so environmental regulations. Any others you can think of?
Cheap power.
Cheap power and energy, all kinds of cheap materials, but the big things are cheap labor, few regulations, and I would also talk about what kind of government are they looking for? If you're going to go do business in a country, what kind of government would be an attractive government to work with? Are you looking for a democracy, or would you be looking more for a dictatorship?
Somewhat stable.
Huh?
Probably somewhat stable.
Stable in terms of what? Well, stable, for example, in terms of your business environment. So if you make a deal with a country and they say, well, here's our workers' wages. They are $1 an hour. And you're thinking as a company, well, will they always be that? Are they going to go up tomorrow or 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Like, I need to know for my projections what my labor costs are going to be. And how could a country guarantee to you, Senor, our wages are $1 an hour today and they're going to be $1 an hour 10 years from now? A democracy can't guarantee that, because a democracy is a little messy. The people have power. They may vote for higher wages tomorrow. They may vote in people that give them higher wages tomorrow. What's more stable from a business standpoint is a dictator, a strong guy in charge who says, I'm going to make sure that that's how it is. And if anybody starts a union, we'll get rid of those guys. Those guys tried to start a union and they disappeared. I don't know if I'm talking about South America here. There's a lot of dictatorships in South America that have been quite violent over the years, and people disappear and people try to start unions and they get killed and things. So dictatorships, China, by the way, is the most popular place right now for global corporations to go set up factories, and China is not a democracy. It calls itself a communist country, which is ironic since it's the heart of capitalism right now. But it is a totalitarian society with a small group of people in charge of everything, and the people really don't have a whole lot of say over things like how many hours they work, or how much money they get paid, or what is in their air or water. And that is the place where our companies like to go. So again, sociologists are saying this new global economy we're dealing with, it's kind of pressuring countries to lower their standard of living, make life more difficult for regular people, make government less responsive and more dominant and controlling of people. And so all of this in the name of free trade. But who's really free because of it? Who's really getting to trade because of it? It's really concentrating wealth in very few hands. In these multinational corporations, there's not that many of them, but they own a lot of the other companies in our world. And so more and more, we're just working for a few companies that own most of the wealth on planet Earth. And that's exactly what Marx and conflict theory would predict in a capitalist society where wealth tends to concentrate and very few people end up with most of it, and most people end up working in pretty substandard situations that doesn't make them happy. I think that's a pretty fair characterization of what America looks like today. And what's weird, what I'm trying to make clear to you, is we seem to have unlearned the lessons that we knew back in 1930s and 40s, that if you have a middle-class society where most people are doing pretty well, that works out really nicely. But if you have a society where only the top people are doing really well and they don't have to pay any taxes, that was another thing we didn't put on here. No taxes is another thing that a lot of companies are looking for. No taxes or low taxes, and so our own country has had to lower its taxes quite a bit. Back in this period, by the way, that I was showing on here, where people were more equal, the rich people paid quite a bit of taxes. Back here, when they were closer to everybody, they paid the highest tax rate was 80% of their income. Nowadays, the rich pay 15% or 13%. And so most of us, when we work at a job, if you work for a living and you get paid a paycheck, you probably pay 30% taxes. But if you make your money off investments, what's called capital gains, you only pay a capital gains tax, and capital gains is 15%. So that's a good example of how the wealthy have been able to say, we don't want to pay taxes, and they don't compared to the rest of us, and they are doing much better than the rest of us. So that's another irony there. And taxes are what's used to build things like parks and public schools and higher education, so working class people can become middle class. So in not taxing themselves, the wealthy not only are taking more of the wealth, they're not providing it back to society in the forms of things like better parks, better sewage systems and lakes and energy systems and all the infrastructure that we were talking about earlier. So what does this mean for sociology? Because I'm getting a little deep into economics here, and if you took an economics class, they would go much more into some of these topics. What we're really interested in this class is, how does all this economic change affect people's daily lives, affect regular Americans in their day-to-day lives? And how does it affect things like race and gender and class? And how does it affect the racial relations in this country and the class relations and the gender relations? And so we're going to watch a video that I think does a really good job of illustrating a lot of that. And the video is called Two American Families. Let me say a few things about the video. It's called Two American Families. It's a really unique documentary, I think, in that it follows these two families, the Stanleys, who are an African-American family, and the Newmans, who are a white family. And they both live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I know I'm going to spell this wrong. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee, Wisconsin is part of that manufacturing, or it was once, we can refer to America as industrial heartland. I think they used that term in this video. The industrial heartland is like the Midwest. you know, like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard. That used to be where America's factories were, manufacturing. And nowadays it's referred to as the Rust Belt, the area of America that used to have factories and used to have manufacturing and really doesn't anymore. And so Milwaukee is one of these places. Detroit, Michigan, by the way, is now considered a ghost town. Detroit used to be the capital of American manufacturing and our auto industry, and now you can go there and you can buy like a whole skyscraper for like $10,000, like a big 30-story building or more. So it's a ghost town. It's not what it once was. It's basically all hollowed out. And Milwaukee is in a similar situation. But what's unique about this movie is it follows these two families from 1991 all the way until 2013. And being able to follow the same group of people over a long period of time is a really fascinating thing, I think, because if you just talk to a bunch of families today about their lives, you don't get the sense of, well, how did your lives change over time? And, you know, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, video is worth like 24,000 words a second. And video that covers a long period of time is valuable, I think, because it shows you things you wouldn't see just in a snapshot of families today, right now. And there's two questions that I would like you to try and answer as you're watching the video. You can just take notes on these questions. I will ask about these questions on our test, so you want to keep notes and be able to know the answers so you can do well on the test. Two questions. One is, what are some of the social problems related to mass unemployment? I mean, when one person loses their job, that's not mass unemployment, that's you lost your job. And it might suck for you, it could be really a bad thing. But when we're talking about a whole city losing its main industry, like the car industry, then we're talking about mass unemployment, large numbers of people losing their jobs all at the same time. And what does that do to the society? What social problems does it cause? For example, when you look at the neighborhoods, are there problems in the neighborhoods, in the schools, in the families, in healthcare? There are, and so that's part of doing the sociology here, is thinking about how do these economic changes affect our communities and affect our families. That's where sociology comes in. And then also related to sociology, but also psychology, is the idea of a masculinity crisis. We haven't really talked about gender yet, and we will later. So you might not know the word masculinity yet or what I mean by that. But what we're talking about is expectations of men. That's what masculinity means. Like, what does our society expect of a man? How do you prove you're a good boy when you're in a family? How do you prove you're a good husband, or a good father, or a good worker, or a good American man? I mean, you know, that's what the expectations of men are. And a crisis could occur when somebody feels, I can't meet these expectations. Society expects me to be doing this, and I can't make it happen. And a man might feel he's having a crisis where I can't live up to these expectations that society has of me. And so I want you to keep in mind as you watch the video, do you see any men struggling in this video with trying to live up to the expectations, trying to meet the expectations that society has of them as sons, fathers, husbands, brothers, boyfriends? Is that clear, what I'm asking? No? Not clear? Yes, clear? Do you need me on screen? If I'm on screen, if I text you, then you'll answer me? No, I'm just kidding. I just have this theory that today's young people you spend all this time on the screen, so when somebody's like looking at you in the face, they're expecting you to go, yes, it is clear, or no, it's not clear, but they're just like, I've never had anyone talk to me. Screens don't talk, they're just glass. I've noticed this. I've been teaching a long time. You guys are different than the kids used to be, students used to be. Anyway, so let's watch Surviving the Good Times. Or it used to be called Surviving the Good Times, this video. It used to only go up until 2001, and I was showing it back then, and I was showing it in like 2010, going, this movie's getting really out of date. But luckily, they went back and refilmed. And so now the video is longer, or it's more up to date. And in some ways I like the older version better, but I gotta get back to Google. And at home, you guys can follow along too and try to answer these questions. I know I never posted a discussion, but I'll try to post one about this video. I'll try to remember to do that. And you guys can participate in our discussion that way. All right. Sorry, it's got this stupid commercial. Why they bother with this commercial? I'm sure no one's watching this, except people in classrooms. So it aired 3 years ago now on PBS. So I doubt people are going online on PBS except for me and a few other professors.
Hello, and welcome to this special edition of Frontline. I'm Bill Moyers. We want to tell you the story of two American families whose lives embody what's happened to the hopes and dreams of millions of Americans over the past 20 years. It's a story that begins in Milwaukee back in 1991 when we first met the Stanleys and the Newmans, families my mother, rest her soul, would have called the salt of the earth.
I want my kids to
grow up to be good kids.
Yeah, I want good children.
I could tell you've been down south a long time. You're saying yes, ma'am.
Hard workers, caring parents, faithful churchgoers, trying to secure a foothold in the middle class. But as we came back to visit them over the years, we watched their children grow and their fortunes change.
Now I'm putting the long hours in. You know, you're getting money, but it's not that much. And you said, what the use?
We saw their work lives upended by the powerful economic and political forces that were altering the American landscape.
Here is my paycheck, $9,646.89. That's poverty.
As America ushered in a new Gilded Age, in Milwaukee, as in the rest of the country, working people found themselves left behind, barely staying even at best. So now, 22 years in the making, the intimate and revealing story of two American families.
Tony and I have known each other since we were probably about 2 years old. His mother and my mother went to school together at Pulaski High School. And our grandparents, when our parents were younger, you know, they played cards. So they were pretty good friends. I don't know, we just started seeing each other, you know, spending a lot of time at each other's houses, and he just asked me out, so I said, okay. We were crazy about each other. We had to spend a lot of time together, you know, and I could just picture myself spending the rest of my life with him. And our expectations were, I thought, you know, you find the man that you like and get married and have a family and get a house, a little white picket fence, you know, those little fairy tale type things. Some of it came true, but some of it, as far as the bumpy roads, I didn't expect either. You know, I knew they weren't going to be all peaches and cream, but you don't think of all the bad things when you're younger.
Once upon a time, Terry Newman and her husband Tony dreamed of a good, simple life.
When we got married, we had started a family right away. He was working factory and I stayed home. And he made pretty good money when we were first married. You know, for a young couple with one little one on the way.
We'll grab a couple and crack them in the pan.
I don't know, we had a good time with one child, so we had another one, and there was Adam. You know, and then I got pregnant with Carissa in '86, and he had lost his job. Then he got hired at Briggs, and we thought, okay, this is a very stable job. You know, we can start saving, and we bought the house.
Buying a home was a big step for a young couple. But Tony had a good job with the engine maker Briggs & Stratton, then the largest employer in the region.
Years ago, if you wanted a small engine, you got a Briggs & Stratton.
For decades, Briggs and dozens of other stalwart Wisconsin manufacturers had helped make Milwaukee just about the American dream's hometown. Celebrated in sitcoms and sentimentalized in beer commercials.
Just the best. So when Miller time rolls around tonight, we raise a glass to you, Milwaukee. You've earned it.
When we met the Newmans in the early 90s, American manufacturers had already begun chasing cheap labor to non-union states and Mexico. Of over 40,000 good-paying jobs lost from Milwaukee in the preceding decade, about 4,000 were from Briggs & Stratton. One of them was Tony Newman's.
Sort of goes like this. Here and here.
He gets into Briggs, and we think, oh, this is a good company. We can buy a house. Now we have the house, we have more bills.
We gotta drill a hole. How big of a hole do you want?
Not that big.
But it's either rent for the rest of your life or own, and we prefer to own. I mean,
That's supposed to be the American
that's
dream.
supposed to be the American dream.
house,
Well, where
a good
is
job.
it? Where is it?
Tony had been making up to $18 an hour plus benefits. Now, the jobs available to a laid-off union worker commonly paid a fraction of that.
I've applied over at grocery stores, hardware stores, there's
McDonald's.
Hardee's,
Cold.
Super America, Pizza Hut, Walmart, Sam's. Most of them will not pay $6 an hour. They're all less than $6 an hour. Little do they know, I need to live also. Thank you. Have a nice day.
And one of these. And then you need a business card to call Mommy up.
While her husband looked for work, Terry tried to bring in some extra money. She bought skincare products and then tried reselling them to her neighbors door to door.
Look in the mirror and feel your face and say, well, you know, it's softer, the complexion, the color. Yeah. And that's basically why I wanted to share this with you.
But she lost money on the deal, and their troubles just got worse.
Are you gonna call him back?
I'm gonna call him back? Yeah, I'm gonna have to call him back.
You talked to him before.
Yeah.
How much is your mortgage a month?
I believe it's like 820.
819.
Yeah, 820 or something like
Have you
that.
been able to make all the payments?
No, we're behind. And today the mortgage company called me again.
Again?
Yes.
What do they say?
I didn't answer them right now because I wanted to talk to Tony and wasn't home. So I wanted to talk to him.
You must
to
dread it
find
when the
out.
phone rings.
I do. I cringe.
Same guy.
Long before the term foreclosure crisis was on America's lips, laid-off working people were learning what it meant.
I did send a $1,000 check in probably a few weeks back, but the check was sent back to me with a letter stating we will not accept a partial payment. I don't really think of that as a partial payment. I think of that as a basic payment and a good gesture on trying to get caught up. Right now we're going through a hard time. My husband's out of work. He went to school and he's looking for a job. And I'm basically just trying to buy a little time so we can get on our feet again, you know, so we can get caught up. I would think that this is just going to be a temporary thing, not a permanent thing, and I really don't want to lose my house. Or are you just trying to tell me that you have to foreclose on the house if I don't have that full amount? You would recommend it.
Is he putting this on paper? I want to know, is he putting this on paper? Dear?
It really bothers us that we have to depend on other people. I just want to get up and do what I have to do. Just go in the car and go grocery shopping, and have a normal life again.
Holding in there okay? Mm-hmm. You get the peanut butter and the honey.
I don't like having to go and ask and say I have no food in the house or something, can you help me out? Where when you would go and work and get a paycheck and come home and support
And
yourself.
then you would be giving this food to other
Right.
people.
Well, now, shoes on the other foot makes me feel very uncomfortable. I'd rather be on the giving side than the receiving.
They have peanut butter, flour, some pork here. I understand that if you put it over noodles or rice and maybe add a little onion, that it's quite palatable.
Oh, what happened to his ear? What, he wants to go back in his house? He doesn't like all you kids.
He don't have
He's
no
yelling.
house.
Oh,
Come here.
can you reach that high? Or you want me to do it?
I want to hold him all the way over.
Okay, you can hold him all the way over there.
Come here.
They've made comments to like, Mom, let's sell the bookshelf. They've got little baseball cards, Mom, I'll sell these. And that hurts.
Okay, let him go in there.
Because they're willing to sell their baseball cards to help their parents out.
Okay. I've been getting very angry lately. I've been losing my temper quite a bit. I've tried doing things. I work in a garage on woodworking things when I get angry, and that helps once in a while. I'm having a hard time dealing with this.
Just kidding, big guy.
What are you doing today?
How do you deal with this pressure, the anger, the
I can't. It's very difficult.
Yeah, our marriage is really on the rocks. This is a really difficult time. This is a real difficult time. I've been thinking about a divorce now for a while.
Why?
I can't deal with the situation. I'm just having a real hard time dealing with it.
Come out and take your medicine. Come on. This is going to be your water.
You feel guilty?
Yeah, I do. I feel I should be supporting my family.
You think he really wants a divorce, or is
So
this just
he'll-
an escape?
I think it's an escape, and I just think he figures it's an easy way out. But really, the problems are still going to be there because he's still going to have to support us, and I feel it's going to be worse. I just feel it's just a tough time, and if we can just get through this, you know, then we'll be back to the life that we had before.
Good morning, everybody. We gather on this Sunday morning in faith to praise our triune God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son.
Tony and Terry prayed for better times. Across town in Milwaukee's Central City, a second hard-working family found their faith being tested. Like Tony Newman, Claude Stanley had also been laid off. He lost his assembly line job with big manufacturer A.O. Smith.
When I got laid off, they wanted me to go on the welfare, but I could not stand in that line. This says not me. This is not me. They wanted to give me food stamps. I said, this ain't me. I don't want no food stamps. I said, I got my strength, my health. I will find me a job. And I found me a job.
He found a job, waterproofing basements for less than $7 an hour. Not even half of what he had been making.
You got to look at it on the real side. I cannot live like I was making $20 an hour. Okay, that money is not there. So you might well get in your mind, it's not there no more. So, okay, bring yourself down.
Claude and his wife Jackie were raising 5 kids. Their daughter Nicole, about to enter college when we met her. The oldest son, Keith, the twins, Claudale and Claude Jr., and the youngest, Omega.
I think the hardest time is when you have to worry about coming home. Like I said, always coming home, and then there's a bill on the door saying the water's cut off, or there's the guy just called saying you can cut off the phone, or the electricity's off, and you have to wait for a couple of days until mom and dad can get enough money to put it back on.
Their neighborhood, Sherman Park, was mostly African American and had once thrived on factory jobs that paid enough to support a family. Now those jobs were disappearing, and people here were trying to figure out what to do next. People like Jackie Stanley, who had lost her job at Briggs.
Any houses in the immediate area that we could show? While I was on the motor line at Briggs, I began to study my real estate. Can I shake your hand? I went 10 times for my real estate license. The 10th time I passed. And I promised that as soon as Briggs did close the door that I was going to go on and do real estate. And that's exactly what I did. Hi, Joe. Yeah, this is Jacqueline Stanley from Homestead. It's just like anything else. It's really unsure. Okay, I just got in and it says ASAP. You only get excited when you're sitting at the closing and have the check in your hand. You never get over exuberant, and I'm learning that every day.
Mom's real estate is tough on her. I've seen her try to will and deal deals. They seem so good, and at the last minute they fall apart.
The listing is for September. It's already October.
And that falling apart is our mortgage. That falling apart is the car notes. And to someone else, it might not seem important that they decide not to buy the house. But for us, it's a matter of not life and death, but it's a matter of light and gas. And that's scary.
As good jobs left town, the number of African Americans in poverty increased from about 25% in the 1970s to over 40% in the early 90s. The Stanleys vowed it wouldn't happen to them. But as property values fell in the central city, so did real estate commissions. And when Jackie tried to sell in other neighborhoods, she met resistance.
It was on the market for a year and didn't sell.
It's because they didn't have somebody as good as you.
Okay.
People of color really have a much more difficult time in our business making a living than white people. It may be a situation where she may call for a showing and not get the courtesy of a callback. Maybe her client that she takes into a mortgage lender has a much more difficult time, even if their credit is good, getting a mortgage.
All right, fax it to me. I can't sell suburbs. I can't sell the most affluent areas here. And that hurts. But they'll call me for Central City.
All right, we're going to pause it there, and we'll see you on Wednesday. We'll pick up the video where we left off. Don't forget to be able to answer the questions that I posed.